The room was so loud you could feel it in your chest. Crystal glasses catching candlelight, jewels catching camera flashes, the low roar of laughter and industry conversation bouncing off marble walls. It was 1994, and the gala, one of those grand old Hollywood affairs that barely exist anymore, was in full swing. Tuxedos and gowns, agents and legends, everybody performing for everybody else. Whitney Houston moved through the room the way she always did in those years, like she was trying to take up as little space as possible while being completely impossible to ignore. She was 31 years old. The Bodyguard soundtrack had sold 30 million copies. I Will Always Love You had become something beyond a song. It was a force of nature, a new measuring stick for every vocalist alive. Everywhere Whitney went, people wanted a piece of something they couldn't quite name. They wanted to stand near her as if proximity to that voice could somehow pass into them. She had smiled through dinner. She had laughed at the right moments and said the gracious things expected of a woman in her position. Inside, as those closest to her would later recall, she felt like a building with a cracked foundation, the outside gleaming, the inside quietly giving way. And then across the room she saw him. If you want to understand what happened next, you first have to understand what it meant to be in the same room as Frank Sinatra in 1994. He was 78 years old. He had already survived longer than anyone expected, outlasted trends and scandals in a world that had tried to bury him at least 3 separate times. His voice had long since changed from the thing of aerial precision it once was. It had deepened, roughened, taken on the texture of everything he had endured. But here's what never changed about Sinatra. The room still tilted toward him. Even at 78, surrounded by decades of newer names, he remained the gravitational center of wherever he stood. This was one of his final public appearances of any real scale, though nobody knew that then. Nobody wanted to know it. Whitney knew who he was with her whole body. She had grown up with his voice in the house the way some children grow up with sunlight. It was simply there, a given, part of the atmosphere. Sissy Houston had made sure of that. Her mother, one of the finest gospel and soul vocalists of her generation, had a deep reverence for the craft of singing, for the architecture of a song, and for the rare few who had elevated the act of standing at a microphone into something that bordered on sacred. Sinatra was on that short list, always had been. Subscribe for more stories like this, and drop a comment below telling us who you think was the greatest voice of the 20th century. Before we get back to that room in 1994, we have to go back further, because what happened that night between two singers, one at the height of her power, one approaching the final chapter of a mythic career, only makes sense if you understand the weight each of them was carrying when they walked through that door. Whitney Elizabeth Houston grew up in Newark, New Jersey, in a household where music wasn't entertainment, it was oxygen. Her mother, Sissy, sang backup for Aretha Franklin, Elvis Presley, David Bowie, and dozens of others, people whose names became monuments. Her cousin was Dionne Warwick. She sang in the choir at New Hope Baptist Church under her mother's direction. And if you have ever heard a recording of young Whitney in that choir, you understand immediately that something was happening there that had almost nothing to do with training. The training came later. The gift was there from the beginning, inconvenient and enormous, like discovering your 6-year-old can carry a piano. By the time Clive Davis signed her to Arista Records in 1983, the machinery of the music industry had a very clear idea of what Whitney Houston should be. She was beautiful in a way that translated perfectly to the glossy pages of magazines. She was young. She was polished. She had that voice, that devastating, cathedral-filling voice. And the men in suits believed, perhaps genuinely, that they were doing her a favor by packaging it. Pop princess, crossover queen, something accessible, something marketable, something that wouldn't frighten the middle of America. What they were asking her to do, without quite saying so, was to dial down the gospel, to sand off the church, to take the raw, shouting, ceiling-lifting holiness of what she had learned in Newark and make it fit inside something neater, something safer. And for a while, Whitney complied, not because she didn't know better, but because she was 20 years old and the men asking had more power than she did. And compliance can look an awful lot like professionalism when you're still learning which battles to pick. The tension never went away. It went underground. It grew in the dark. By 1991, when she stood at the Super Bowl in Tampa and sang the national anthem over a stadium of 73,000 people while soldiers were fighting in the Gulf, something cracked open that nobody could put back. That performance, the way she held the land of the free until the note seemed to reach some kind of physical limit and then surpassed it anyway, that wasn't pop polish. That wasn't the crossover product. That was the church girl from Newark, the one they had been managing and containing for 8 years, finally running so far ahead of everyone that there was nothing left to do but watch. But here's the thing about that kind of power. It has a cost, not for the audience, for the person doing it. Whitney Houston gave something of herself in those performances that she could never get back. And by 1994, the accounts of those around her suggest a woman who was starting to feel the depth of that subtraction. The expectations had grown exponentially. The machine wanted more of that Super Bowl magic, more of that bodyguard thunder, on demand, reliably, forever. And Whitney, who had never been permitted to simply be human inside her own career, was beginning to understand that the gap between what people needed from her and what she actually had left was widening in ways she couldn't discuss with anyone. But that night, she could not have anticipated what was coming across the room toward her. Sinatra saw her before she saw him. That detail matters. By all accounts from people present that evening, he had been watching her from across the room for some time before he made his move. Maybe he recognized something. Maybe an old singer can see things in another singer that the audience never can. The way a marathon runner can look at someone in a crowd and clock immediately whether they've ever run 20 miles. Whatever the reason, Sinatra separated himself from his circle with that particular deliberateness he had always possessed, and he crossed the room. What happened next lasted approximately 90 seconds. He greeted her warmly, the way old Hollywood greeted everyone, with a full presence, eyes actually on you, the sense that you were the only person in the room. They exchanged a few words that multiple witnesses recall as light, almost laughing. Then Sinatra leaned in. He spoke close to her ear, quietly enough that no one around them could hear. Whatever he said only once. He didn't repeat himself. He pulled back, looked at her for a moment with an expression that people who were watching from a distance described differently. Some said it was kind, some said it was something harder than kind, something more like the face of a doctor delivering a prognosis. And then he moved away. Back into the current of the evening. Whitney stood completely still. This is the detail that everyone who witnessed it agrees on. She went still in a way that was not shock, not offense, not the freeze of someone who has been insulted. It was something more interior than any of those things. Her eyes were fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. After a few seconds, she produced a smile. But the people nearest her noticed that the smile was the kind that comes from the throat, not the face. It was the practiced smile of someone who has just received information they were not ready for and is buying time until they can be alone with it. She didn't say anything to anyone for the remainder of that evening about what Sinatra had told her. Not to her assistant, not to her closest friends in attendance, not to the journalist who later asked. She kept it entirely to herself. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998. He was 82. The obituaries ran for days and filled entire newspapers. Every singer of every genre offered tribute. Whitney was among them, and her public statement was gracious and general. The kind of thing you say when you are not ready to say the real thing. Years later, and this is the detail that has never been fully excavated by anyone, in a single interview that most people overlooked at the time, Whitney was asked about memorable encounters she had never spoken about publicly. She paused for longer than the interviewer expected. Then she said in almost an offhand way, as if she hadn't meant to let it surface, "There was something that Frank said to me once. He told me the thing I was most afraid of." The interviewer, perhaps sensing they had stumbled onto something significant, pressed her. What was it? What did he say? Whitney smiled, the same smile by all descriptions that she had worn that night in 1994. "I'll keep that," she said, and changed the subject. "What did Frank Sinatra know?" He was a man who had spent 60 years inside the machine of the music industry, who had been built up, torn down, blacklisted, resurrected, mythologized, and humanized more times than almost anyone in the history of American popular culture. He knew what the industry did to voices it had decided to own. He knew what happened when the gap between public expectation and private reality became too large to manage. He had lived inside that gap himself in the 1950s, when Capitol Records was selling America on the image of a man in perfect command of everything, while the private reality was considerably more complicated. Maybe he saw it in her, the exhaustion behind the precision, the smile that was working harder than it should, the way she moved through the room as though every room had become a stage, and every stage had become a place where the real Whitney Houston was not entirely welcome. Maybe he told her that the voice is always the first thing they call yours, and the last thing they let you keep. Maybe he told her to rest before it was too late to rest. Maybe he told her that the machine will ask for everything you have, and thank you afterward with a star on a sidewalk. Or maybe it was something more personal, something only another singer could say to another singer, in the private language of people who know what it costs to stand at a microphone and mean it. We will never know. What we know is this: in the years that followed that gala, Whitney Houston continued to perform, continued to record, continued to be one of the most gifted vocalists the American musical tradition has ever produced. She also continued to struggle, privately, then less privately, with the weight of a life that had been largely defined by other people's ideas of what her voice should be doing. She fought battles she should never have had to fight alone. She carried things she should have been able to put down. And somewhere in all of that, she kept what Sinatra said to her. Carried it the way you carry something you are not yet ready to act on. The way you carry a truth that is too sharp to hold directly, so you wrap it in everything else and keep moving. When Sinatra leaned in to speak to her that night, the room continued its roar all around them. Glasses clinked. Cameras flashed. Two singers stood briefly in the same 4 feet of space, one near the beginning of her last decade, one near the end of his, and something passed between them that neither the industry nor the audience would ever fully account for. He told her the thing she was most afraid of, and she kept it.